大家晚上好，我是汤敏，是国务院参事，同时还是好几个非政府组织NGO 的工作人员主要致力于农村发展和减贫。我曾经在亚洲开发银行和国务院发展研究中心下的中国发展研究基金会工作。今天呢，将由我来主持学观中西这场交流。观是观察的观这个活动呢是由普林斯顿大学出版社和中国新闻周刊联合发起的，叫学观中西项目。那么这个项目呢，希望通过邀请普林斯顿大学出版社在各个学科领域的顶级作者搭建一个影响世界的中西方学者对话平台，就具有传播性的思想议题展开对话。那么本次活动呢是学观中西项目的开篇，由普林斯顿大学出版社、中国新闻周刊以及北大新结构经济学研究中心、北大国发院联合主办。那么下面呢，请允许我来隆重的介绍今晚的3位嘉宾第一位是安妮·凯斯 Ann Case 教授，他是普林斯顿大学政治学和公共事务的荣休教授，是美国国家科学院院士。凯斯教授常年呢从事健康经济学方面的研究。第二位重磅嘉宾是安格斯·迪顿教授，他是2015年的诺贝尔经济学奖获得者。普林斯顿大学的经济学和国际事务艾森豪威尔讲席荣休教授，他同时也是南加州大学经济学首席教授，著有由普林斯顿大学出版的The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and the Origin of Inequality。最后一位是大家都熟悉的林毅夫教授，他曾经是世界银行高级副行长和首席经济学家现在是北京大学新结构经济研究中心的主任，北京大学的国发院的名誉院长。他出版过很多的书籍，包括在普林斯顿大学出版社出版的2本书，一本呢叫 Beating the Odds Jumpstart Development Countries and the Quest and Prosperity, How Developing Economy Can Take Off 这2本书。那今天的讨论主要是讨论由凯斯和迪顿2位教授最新刚刚由2020年由普林斯顿大学出版社出版的叫 Death of Despair and the Future of Capitalism。这本书描绘了美国白人工薪阶级目前的处境，现在到处都是破裂的家庭，前景渺茫。2位作者呢，将这场危机与劳动者地位的下降、公司实力的增强联系在一起，而其中最重要的是贪婪的医保部门将工人阶级的工资重新分配到富人的口袋里。那么在今天活动中呢，凯斯和迪顿教授将与林毅夫教授呢就他们的新书进行交流。那么首先让我们来欢迎凯斯教授和迪顿教授来介绍他们书的主要内容。
Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction. So we're going to do a PowerPoint, and we're going to share our screen.
And I will be doing the presentation, and then Angus and I will jointly be answering questions during the discussion. So we're delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to join you today. And we will be talking about our book, Deaths of Despair. And the book grew out of a series of articles that Angus and I have worked on since 2015. And our work, we are grateful to acknowledge funding we have received from the National Institutes of Health in America for this work. As an overview, even before COVID-19, the lives of Americans without a four-year college degree, what we call a bachelor's degree, were coming apart. And in the US, that's 2/3 of the population between the ages of 25 and 64. So it's a majority of people. And in the book, what we do is we document what that means in terms of despair and excess mortality. And then we dig in and we discuss the long-run forces behind that. And so we'll talk about that this evening in China, this morning in Princeton, New Jersey. To give you some background, though, it's if we look over time, over the 20th century was a time of great progress in terms of mortality. So if we look at mortality, which is measured by number of deaths per 100,000 people at risk of dying, what you see is over the sweep of the 20th century, mortality fell from about 1,500 per 100,000 for white men and women aged 45 to 54, down to 400 per 100,000 by the end of the century. You can see the 1918 flu pandemic here, but for the most part, what we see is progress. And we thought that that would continue into the 21st century. And in countries that we think of as being comparison countries to the US, the rich countries of Europe, the other English-speaking countries, what we see is that that kind of progress for people aged 45 to 54 did continue, and mortality fell at 2% per year over the course of between 1990 and the 2010s. But in the US, things went differently. So what happened in the US was that for white non-Hispanics, which are the most educated, the wealthiest of the subgroups, mortality stopped falling and actually began to rise. For Hispanics, what we see is that their mortality decline looks very much like people in the United Kingdom. The Hispanics here are the thick blue line. And for African Americans, for Blacks in the US, mortality is higher than for any of these groups, but it was falling over this period very rapidly. So the white non-Hispanics look different. And in fact, it's just a big surprise that their mortality would just stop falling altogether. Now, is this a big issue? Well, it's a big enough issue that life expectancy in the US fell for 3 years straight between 2014 and 2017. And that hadn't happened in a century. That hadn't happened since the 1918 flu epidemic. And the decline in life expectancy was being driven by what was happening to mortality among aged people. So this was all very surprising. Part of it was due to the fact that we had been making great progress against heart disease. And that progress slowed and then stopped altogether for reasons that we could come back to in the discussion, but that is still not entirely clear why we stopped altogether making progress against heart disease. But as we dug in, what we saw was that there were also 3 causes of death where mortality rates were rising rather than falling. The biggest 3 were from drug overdose, from suicide, and from alcoholic liver disease. This is for one 5-year age group. These are white non-Hispanics between the ages of 50 and 54. And we've divided the screen here between people who have a college degree, a 4-year college degree in the US. Those are people with a BA, and people without a bachelor's degree. And what we see is that this rise in mortality from these causes is primarily among people who have not been to college or do not have a college degree. And what we find in the book is that that college degree is a very meaningful dividing line. The fraction of people in the US with a bachelor's degree had changed very little since the birth cohort of 1945. And so it's not as if the people without a bachelor's degree were becoming somehow, they were a sicker group or they just were less motivated. It's the same proportion of the population without a bachelor's degree over this whole period. Now, education is recorded on the US death certificates. Occupation is not, income is not. So we focused on education, but it turned out to be a very meaningful dividing line for many, many dysfunctions, bad things that were happening in the US. What I had showed you was for this group aged 50 to 54, but this increase among people without a college degree is true for every 5-year age group. And we had hoped that maybe when people got to retirement age, that somehow this would stop. That after they retired, they would be eligible for Social Security, a pension from the government, and free medical care, and that maybe things would be better for them. But what we're finding is, even among this group, things are beginning to look worse. Whoops. Now, there were 158,000 deaths in the US from drugs, alcohol, and suicide in 2017 and again in 2018. And that is up from about 65,000 deaths in 1995. So this gives you a sense of how much worse the crisis is now, almost 100,000 people per year worse. This number is smaller than the number of people who have died in the US from COVID. But in the new year, there will be vaccines against COVID. But we don't see a vaccine that's going to help with drugs or alcohol or suicide coming to the rescue. And we have no reason to believe that this epidemic of what we came to call deaths of despair it's going to stop. Now, you can look by age group, every 5-year age group here. But what we found was more useful in the book was to look by birth cohort. So here what we're looking at for people without a bachelor's degree, by every 5-year birth cohort, these are all the people born in 1940, 1950, 1960. And what you see is that at any given age, people who were born later in the century are at higher risk of dying from drugs, from alcohol, from suicide. So it's not as if this is just about baby boomers in the US, the generation that was born right after the Second World War. Yes, they are at risk, but these later born birth cohorts are at even higher risk. And if you compare the ones people without a BA to people with a BA, what you see is that they look like they live in different universes. People with a BA are not at much higher risk from birth cohort to birth cohort, but the people without a BA are. Now, when we thought about this, this took us back to work that was done in the 1800s by Durkheim, who was one of the fathers of sociology, who studied suicide and thought of suicide as being something that was caused by a lack of social integration or social regulation. And he posited that suicides are more likely at times of great upheaval, and that we are seeing great upheaval in the lives of people without a bachelor's degree. And we think that we'll come back to what we think the underlying causes are here, but we're going to lean on work that was done in the 1800s. What do we know about who is dying? In the US, it's geographically very widespread. So every US state saw increases in all three of these causes of death, suicide, drugs, and alcohol, between 2000 and 2018. It's also happening not just to men, but to men and to women. So if we go back, and this is again just one 5-year age group, but I could show you this for all of these 5-year age groups. Back in the day, back in the early 90s, men were more likely to commit suicide and take drugs and die of drug overdoses than were women. But the increases here for men and women without a bachelor's degree are almost identical. So it's happening to people without a BA, it's happening to both men and women, it's happening across the US. When we looked at whether or not current unemployment rates or current levels of income could help us understand why people were killing themselves in these ways, what we found was we cannot pin it to current conditions. What we see here is that these things are rising before the Great Recession, the financial crisis of 2008. They rise during it and they rise after it. So whatever it is, we think the roots of this are older and deeper than just what's happening to people currently. Underneath the deaths, what we find is that for people without a bachelor's degree, people who have not been to college, people are reporting more pain every year and more social isolation, more difficulty socializing with friends, more difficulty relaxing at home, and with poor mental health as well. Now, those things, reports of pain, are self-reported, so they're easier to sort of say, well, that's maybe not true. But when you put that together with the fact that mortality is rising, we think that there's a larger picture here of people being more ill and also dying from these causes. Now, what do we think are the roots of this? We think it's due to one long-term labor market decline for people without a bachelor's degree in the US. This is for men aged 25 to 54 without a 4-year college degree. What we find is that their real wages have been in long-term decline going back at least as far as 1980. So this follows the business cycle. So wages rise and fall with the business cycle, but the long-term decline trend here is down. And at the same time, they have less attachment to the labor market. If you look at the number of men in this age group employed relative to the size of the population, again, you see that there are business cycle effects here. These red dots are for recessions. And so you see people lose their jobs during recessions, then they come back into the labor market, then they lose their jobs again, come back into the labor market. But when they come back into the labor market, they never reach the same level they had been at prior to the last recession. So there's less and less and less attachment to the labor market. And this ends before COVID, but again, there's been this enormous plummet during the COVID crisis as well. In the US, there's very little wage change within a job. So when wages fall, it's because people lose jobs and replace them with jobs that are not as good. Many of the replaced jobs in the US are worse jobs. Jobs in the US, many for people with less than a college degree, are now what we call outsourced jobs, jobs that are in transport companies or security companies or food service companies. So rather than working for a large corporation and being part of the food service team, instead you're part of some outside operation that comes in to provide the food or to provide the cleaning services. There's less commitment between employers and employees. And it's much harder to see those jobs, these outsourced jobs, as being part of a good life or belonging to a large company. And as an example, in these Amazon warehouses, the majority of staff come from an outsourced firm called Integrity Staffing Solutions, rather than being Amazon employees. We see this losing of good jobs less, though, about being about wages and more about having a loss of meaning or loss of status that comes from work. At the same time, people who don't have good jobs felt that they couldn't get married. So marriage rates in the US have fallen for people without a bachelor's degree, not true for people with a bachelor's degree. People who don't get married live together, there's cohabitation, and they have children together, but then they break up. There might be new relationships. Children end up living with one parent, the other parent is gone. They may have new children with other partners, but there's then a real fragility, less stability in home life, less stability in work life, and also a real loss of community. Now, the book is mostly about what's happened to the white working class, because that's happened to them between 1990 and 2018. But the parallels here to what happened to the Black community in the US in the 1960s and 70s, there are many parallels. When jobs were lost in the inner cities, when manufacturing moved out, when jobs went away. Now, what happened to the white working class? Labor was weakened by globalization and automation, but that happened in other rich countries as well, who didn't see deaths rising from suicide or drugs or alcohol. So what's different about the US? And we focus on two things. One is that the US had a terrible opioid epidemic that was caused by the fact that big pharmaceutical companies were allowed to spread very, very powerful drugs, which are basically heroin in pill form, and that any doctor with a prescription pad could prescribe this very heavy drug to anyone in the US. We argue in the book that the despair that we see came before the opioids, but that the opioid epidemic just made this much worse. The opioids landed on ground that was fertile for abuse. People were looking for a way to take away the pain and to take away the psychic pain, the psychological pain that they were in. And the big pharmaceutical companies actually targeted that despair, making this much worse than it would have been otherwise. What else is different about the US? Well, the US has the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but using many metrics, Americans have the worst health in the rich world. We argue in the book that life expectancy fell in the US, not in spite of what we spend on healthcare, but because of what we spend on healthcare. And we make comparisons with other rich countries over the period between 1970 and 2015. So if you look at, for example, the United Kingdom, and you look at life expectancy at birth against how much they spend on healthcare per person in the UK, both rose over the period between 1970 and 2015. Life expectancy went up and costs went up. In Australia, they're very similar. In Canada, both that happened as well. In France, in the same neighborhood. In Switzerland, which is the second most expensive system, you can see that, and in any given year, 1970, for example, the Swiss are spending more. Their life expectancy is also higher. But in the US, what happened was between 1970 and 1982, our life expectancy is a little bit lower than the other countries, but the spending is, and the spending is a little bit more expensive. Between 82 and 90, the spending begins to grow dramatically. And between 1990 and 2015, the spending in the US is just totally out of control. So the US spends almost $1.05 of GDP on healthcare. The Swiss, being the next expensive, spends about 12% and live 5 years longer than the US live on average. The difference in spending of 5.4% is more than $1 trillion a year, or more than $8,300 a household. And that's just the excess spending. That's just what we think of as being the waste in spending. It's half again as much as we spend on the entire US military. And that spending on healthcare has to come from somewhere. And it comes out of wages and profits and taxes that we pay to the government. In the US, we tie health insurance to employers, which is a crazy system that the other countries of the rich world do not do. Many people think that their employer-provided healthcare is a gift to them, but that gift is being deducted in part or in whole from their paycheck, and causes wages for people at the bottom of the distribution to fall as the employer has to pay more for their health care. So many firms who have to pay their share of a $21,000 a year premium for a family healthcare policy decides that the low-wage worker isn't worth hiring, and those jobs are outsourced. The payments that the employer has to make don't really depend much on how much the worker earns. So it's like a poll tax. It's a per worker tax that must be paid. In the US, there has been for a very long time a debate over whether minimum wages cause employment to fall. But there's been very little discussion on whether or not employer-provided healthcare causes employment to fall, which is sort of a big question to us because it's a very important part of whether or not employers want to employ low-wage workers. We argue that the financing of healthcare in this way, it just takes a wrecking ball to the low-skilled labor market. State governments in the US have to pay their share of medical insurance for poor people. And as that insurance for poor people goes up, then the governments have less money for schools, for public universities, for infrastructure. And so this spending on healthcare eats into all of what we would be spending on things we really need. Now, what to do? In the book, we talk about the future of capitalism, not the failure of capitalism. And we think that capitalism in the US needs to be put back up on the rails. It needs to be fixed. It does not need to be abandoned. It needs to be made fairer. We think healthcare reform is incredibly important because this is something that the US is doing to itself. It's a self-inflicted wound. We wonder whether COVID might give us a chance to do that, being a crisis that's so big that perhaps there will be real debate on what to do about healthcare. But the healthcare industry in the US is very powerful, very wealthy. It has 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress. more generally in the US, what's happened to capitalism is that corporate lobbying and the decline of unions has left low-wage workers, less educated workers with less representation in Washington, D.C. And there's a saying in the US that if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And we worry that that's part of what's happening to people in the US without a college degree. So we will stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much, and a very excellent presentation. Professor didn't have any additional message, or we? Do you want to?
I like Anne to do this because she does it so much better than I do.
Okay.
And that's, I mean, there's lots of additional things we could add as we go along, and you know, we can talk about some of that. And it's clear that at the end of the book, you know, we wrote the book before the COVID pandemic, and a lot of the themes of the book, especially the differential treatment of people who are more or less educated, have resonance in the pandemic economy too. But maybe we can talk about those as we go. Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. The next we are Professor Justin Lin, and you have a comments, or you have any your presentation on your site and talk about the Chinese Medicare system and compare those information. Please, Professor Lin, your turn.
感到非常荣幸啊，可以在2位国际上著名的关于健康体系的经济学家面前呢，来讨论呢中国的医疗健康体系跟它的成绩。我们知道，衡量一个国家的医疗健康体系的好坏，可以用人均的预期寿命来衡量。同时，我们也知道呢，人均预期寿命跟人均的收入水平、人均的 GDP 水平高度相关。那么从这个角度来看的话，中国从1949年建国以后，在这个中国的健康医疗体系上面，应该讲取得了辉煌的成就。尤其是从1949年到1978年改革之前，那29、30年的时间的成绩更是了不起。因为在1949年的时候，中国是世界上最贫穷的国家之一。但那时候因为穷，所以人均的预期寿命只有35岁。那么到了1978年的时候，中国从人均 GDP 来看，还是世界上最贫穷的国家之一。但是中国的人均预期寿命就从35岁提高到65.9岁，增加了30岁。那么这是什么概念呢？我们可以跟一些数字来做比较。比如说1978年的时候，印度的人均 GDP 按照美元计算是203美元，而中国就156美元。但是就是中国的人均 GDP 比印度低了30%。而印度呢，在1978年的时候，它的人均预期寿命只有52.8岁，比中国低了13岁。中国是65.9，印度是52.8， 它比中国低了13岁。如果跟低收入国家平均来比，1978年低收入国家平均的预期寿命是47.6岁，中国呢是高的是8.3岁。而且呢，这个比较，如果说我们跟中等国家或是上中等国家来比，那这个成绩更了不起。因为在1978年的时候，中等收入国家的人均预期寿命是60岁，而中国是65.9岁。中国当时是世界上最穷的国家之一。那中国呢，比中等收入国家的平均数高了5.9岁。而且呢，就是跟上中等收入国家 （upper middle income country）， 他们在1978年的平均数是64.4岁，而中国呢是65.9岁。中国作为一个世界上最贫穷的国家之一，那比上中等国家的人均寿命的预期寿命还高了1.5岁。那这可以讲说是一个奇迹。那么为什么能够达到这么高的成绩呢？我想呢，是因为中国在建国以后有一个非常好的医疗体系。这个医疗体系我们知道，在城市里面，因为都是政府的雇员、国有企业的职工或是局里企业的职工，那么对他们呢是有公费医疗，所以覆盖面非常的广。那么当时80%的人呢是住在农村的。那么在农村里面也有一个非常好的医疗体系，它只要包含3个方面。一个呢是3级医疗预防的保健体系，有县里面的医院为龙头，然后呢有县里面的卫生院为枢纽，然后呢从县到乡，每个乡有卫生所那么每个村呢有卫生室，那么可以提供呢基本的医疗服务跟呢保健预防的服务。同时呢，在农村里面呢也推行合作医疗这个生产队公社它有合作医疗那么一般呢农民看病的时候是可以报销的，并且呢在农村里面还有一个制度，有赤脚医生他们虽然受的训练不多不是说要得到医学院很高的教育水平，但他们呢受到最基本的这个医学的常识，那一般小病呢他们是能够处理的。那么能处理的话就在生产队在村里面就处理的，不能处理的像到这里面乡里面或是县里面，那么就靠这农村的这样的3个方面的医疗制度，让中国呢它的人均预期寿命比上东省收入国家的人均预期寿命还高了1.5岁。也就是这个成绩，所以在1978年的时候，世界卫生组织在阿拉木图开了一个国际会议，那么发表了阿拉木图宣言，来把中国的经验介绍给其他发展中国家来改善他们的健康服务，来提高他们的生命预期。那么从1978年以后，中国进入到改革开放。中国的改革开放从提高人均收入水平的成绩，可以讲说是另外一个奇迹。因为从1978年到2019年，中国的 GDP 它每年的增长速度平均起来 是9.4%，人均 GDP 的提高则达到8.4%，就达到8.4%。那我们可以讲，在人类历史上，没有看到任何一个国家、任何一个地区以这么高的增长速度来提高人民的收入水平。那我前面提到，健康或是人的预期寿命是跟收入水平高度相关的，所以可以想象，中国的人均预期的寿命是在提高的。因为呢，在1978年的时候，前面讲到是65.9岁，那么到2018年，这是世界银行公布的最新数据，它呢人均寿命呢提高到76.7岁，提高到76.7岁，也就是在这40年当中，从78年到2018年。中国的人均预期寿命的提高是达到10.8岁，这当然是不错的。但是我们如果跟其他中等收入国家的增长来比的话，那么实际上呢，这个成绩是不令人满意的。因为中等收入国家、上中等收入国家 （upper medium income country）， 他们的人均 GDP 从1978到2018这40年，平均每年的增长是 2.9%， 只有中国的 8.4% 的1/3。但是他们的人均预期寿命是从 64.4 岁提高到 75.3 岁，提高到 75.3 岁，他们的人均寿命的提高是 10.9 岁，中国增加 10.8 岁，他们增加 10.9 岁，但是他们收入水平提高只有中国的1/3啊。所以这样讲起来的话虽然呢我们改革开放以后经济发展的绩效非常好，那么健康医疗这方面呢，应该讲改善的是差强人意的，而且呢，跟其他国家比较起来的话，中国可能有一些吃老本的情形。那我们来看看呢，中国在从市场化改革以后，在医疗体系上面做了哪些改革？我想呢，就是城市里面的公费医疗本来是你看病都可以报销的变成呢基本医疗保险当然这个覆盖面是全面的，有基本医疗保险。那么基本医疗保险的话，就是一部分由政府出钱，一部分由企业出钱或是你所在的单位出钱，再加上你自己要交的保险费。同时呢，你在医疗上面是可以报销，但报销有一个门槛，你要是多少花费以后你才能够报销，太低的花费不报销。另外呢，也有封顶，如果的医疗费太高了，那你就不能报销，而是报销的比例就逐渐下降，那到了一个顶以后就不能报销了。农村里面呢赤脚医生没有了，然后呢农村呢有一个新的农村合作医疗，同样呢是政府出一部分钱那么农民出一部分钱，同样的他就看病的时候有一个开始可以报销的这个门槛，过了这个门槛以后，你可以按一定比例报销，然后呢有一个封顶的最高的限额。所以呢，如果跟过去比的话，那么当然合作医疗这个体系还在的，但是呢个人要承担的比例随着收入水平提高在增加，就代表呢公家 负担的比例在减少，同时呢有一个最高的限额。3级医疗体系还是存在的。3级医疗体系的话，那么就是这个县医院、县卫生院啊、镇卫生所啊，那么村里面的卫生室，这个呢还是存在的啊，这个倒是变化不大。我想变化最大的是在医院进行改革，因为呢，在7、8年以前，医院的所有投资来自于政府财政，医院的所有开销也来自于政府的财政。但是呢，从1978年的改革开放以后，为了减少政府的财政投入，现在呢，医院的开支当中，大约只有10%是来自于财政的拨款，从100%变成10%。那么维持医院运转的费用怎么来呢？就要医院自己靠医疗的收入来解决。那同时呢，又要保留医院是一个公共服务，所以中国就采取了一个很特殊的有扭曲性质的制度，也就是呢，这个门诊价格非常的低，医生看病的费用也非常的低那这上面呢，基本上医院是不能够这个是不能够 cover， 不能够解决他所要支付的养医生的钱那么医院怎么来维持呢？他就采取一个叫以药养医，可以在医药上面赚钱。比如说你从这个批发下来的药，你可以加20%加30%或是更多，然后从药上面来赚取收入。另外呢，检查上面也可以收取比较高的费用。所以这种以药养医的制度之下呢，就造成了一个呢医疗费用大量增加。因为呢，医院为了来解决它的比如说医生的开支、医院的基础设施还有其他的开支，就很容易造成多开药药其实不用那么多，能多开的，或是专门去开那个价格很高的药，因为呢，它按一定的比例，价格越高，医院能够赚取的这个盈余就越多，并且呢去多做检查。你去了以后，你不管什么病，先做一系列的检查，那这样导致呢，这个医疗的这个支出就大量增加。你比如说在2008年的时候，中国的医疗费用的支出是1.2万亿人民币，那么到了2019年去年的时候，那就增加了5倍，到了6.6万亿人民币。那么这样导致的结果是怎么样？看病就越来越贵看病就越来越贵，有些人就会支付不起。那么尤其有封顶，超过这个顶的话，那你就基本上全部自己支付。但是我们知道很多收入比较低的人是没办法支付的。而且呢，在门诊费用低的状况，而且再加上呢，人才好的医生等等都往好的医院集中，那么在门诊费很低的状况之下呢，就会造成大家都跑到这些所谓3甲大的医院去，在那个地方呢排队非常的难。有时候为了看好的医生，你等可能几天几个月才能等到你能看的医生就会造成看病难、看病贵的情形。并且呢，在这个3级医院里面，比如说县里面的医院那么 或是呢等级比较低的医院，他呢去的医生的患人就少了，所以呢医疗资源有的地方就大量浪费，有的地方呢就会变成不足啊。那么在这些呢三甲医院这些好的医院里面呢，排队很难又很贵，就容易造成呢医生跟呢这个病人的这种矛盾，所以医患冲突啊，医生跟患者的冲突在国内呢就时有所闻。那么再加上呢这个医药呢在开的时候，这些呢生产医药的企业它是市场化的它如果卖的越多，它这个企业赚的钱就越多，那么经常形成呢这些医药的企业药企去贿赂医生，叫他多开药，那医生就收回扣那么医生这个收回扣呢变成医生收入的一个主要来源，那么所以呢腐败的现象也就呢寻租腐败的现象也就呢非常普遍。所以这样讲起来呢虽然往市场向化方向的改革是必要的，但是呢它所带来的医疗服务的质量的提高呢是远远低于中国收入水平提高所应该表现出来的。那么在这种状况之下呢，就是要改革。那么在医疗改革，尤其医院这个体系改革上面呢，基本上有两种思路。那么第一个思路是在2000年的时候，由江苏省的一个地级市叫宿迁，它人口590万，将近600万人的城市。它基本上的思路呢，就是全部的民营化，全部的私营化。他把所有的公家的医院都把它转成民营，都卖给私人来经营。然后这样的话，当然呢，政府就不需要投入那么这完全市场化以后呢，不能说它完全没有好处，因为呢，就有不少私人资本进入到医院体系里面，所以呢，就开了很多医院。那么看病难的问题是解决了。过去如果你要去大的医院看病，一等1个星期或是1个月，现在不用了那么看病难的问题解决了，但是看病贵的问题没有解决，因为呢这些民营的医疗企业医院，它是以盈利为目的，而它盈利多少呢要决定于他做了多少检查，做的检查越多，他盈利就越多，开的药越多，他的盈利也越多所以在这种状况之下呢，这个看病贵的问题没有解决，并且呢，以盈利为目的的这些医院呢，他不太愿意去培养医生，在这方面做投资，在医师上面、护士上做投资，他怕说我投资了一个好的医生，那么会不会给其他医院抢走所以这是第二个问题。那么第三个问题呢，就是对一些比较贵的这种设备的民营的医院不太愿意投资，还有呢一些比较少见的这种病而且要设备的少见的病，这医院不愿意投资。所以呢，在宿迁改革以后呢，就出现了有些病过去在宿迁是能看的，现在宿迁不能看，所以后来呢，不得不宿迁市政府，它呢又重新建立了一个它是1级的综合医院来解决这个问题。所以这是一个改革，全市场化的改革方向。另外一个改革方向呢，是2012年在福建省的一个三明市，它进行了试点。它这个改革呢，基本上是这样的，就是说，这个看病贵，最主要的原因是什么？最主要的原因呢是以前完全市场化的医药采购的时候，那么当中有很多漏洞，然后呢加价非常的多那么从这个企业药企到医院当中有太多环节，那么 一个呢出厂的价格到医院所用的时候，它的增加了好几倍啊。然后呢，当中就有很多可以收贿赂的情形啊等等。那么在三民这个地方呢，它就由市里面设立一个医疗保障局，它在采购医药上的时候，由这个市的这个局来统一采购，然后呢公开竞标，让这些企业自己来竞标来出价，然后它采取最低的价格啊。然后这里面呢就把由药企跟医院跟医生的这一条渠道的把它切断。然后呢，二方面呢，它提高医生的收入到一个合理的水平啊。医生的收入在美国它一般是人均这个工资水平的3倍4倍。那么在中国过去，它刚刚开始改革的时候，医生的工资跟一般职工的工资是一样的。它现在把它提高到一个3倍5倍的这个合理水平，同时呢，来加强对医院的管理。那这样导致的结果呢，就是几方面的好处明显的表现出来，就是病人所要支付的医疗费用当中，过去很大一部分是医药的费用，现在这医药费用明显下降。而且呢，医务人员过去呢是靠贿赂来增加收入的，他现在呢是阳光收入，合理的收入。然后呢，政府呢，它基本上的财政支出也没有增加，它的财政支出呢，它主要是用来对医院的基础比如说这个盖病房啊、买设备的投资然后过去呢，它的这个医保就基本医保的这个有很大的赤字，现在基本上也可以维持平衡，所以呢，这变成是一个成功的改革的经验。那么在三民医改取得了经验以后中国过去的一个办法一向都是有个地方先试点，然后看它试点的结果怎么样，好的不好的那就停止，好的话就在全国推广。那目前呢，中国现在医疗改革的这个方向是往三民医改的方向，在国家的层面设立国家医疗保障局，然后医药由各省各市的这个医疗保障局来统一采购，然后它一个目录什么药那么哪些病只能用什么药跟那个如果功能同样的话，那就用这种价格合理的药等等，这是往这个的方向去改。然后医生的价格呢，医生的工资呢也逐渐的由靠贿赂，然后将来变成阳光收入。但这个呢，在中国目前只是在推广，逐步的推广，还并不是全国统一的制度。那么总的来讲呢，在这种新的这个方向改革效果会怎么样？我希望呢，将来有机会能够像这个Professor Deaton 跟 Professor Case 他们这样非常详细的实证的资料来检验呢，中国这种医疗体系的变革对中国的健康、中国人的寿命的这种影响到底会往哪个方向去影响。但总的来讲呢，我想这个健康是跟收入水平相关的，但是很大的也跟这个医疗体制相关。中国在7、8年之前，虽然收入水平很低，但是因为有比较好的医疗保障体系，所以人的生命预期可以比上中等收入国家还要高。那么最主要的原因呢，就是说在医疗体系里面有很多信息不对称的地方，那么经常容易出现呢一些道德风险的地方，政府应该扮演一定积极有为的作用。而在政府要发挥它作用的时候呢，还要避免一些利益集团的绑架如果被利益集团绑架了以后，政府的干预可能造成的结果还更糟。那么呢，这是从美国的经验我们可以学习到的，也可以从中国 自己从1949年的经验的反思当中呢，获得经验教训的。那我们希望呢，中国在这个医疗改革上面也能够像经济发展取得那么样的成功，那么让人的这个预期寿命能够提高，让人的健康能够提高，这应该是健康中国所要达到的目标。好，我就发言到这里。
Thank you very much, and a very excellent presentation. And Professor Case and Professor Lin both present what's happened in the United States, what's happened in China. It seems these two countries, there are some parallels, at least a certain period, right? And they are in China, even United States, they do have a period quite a good situation, and like if in terms of modalities rate before 1970 seems okay, right? Only after that seems getting deteriorating. In China, it's also before this 1970s, before healthcare more or less okay, but later we do reforms, too much market, too much, then we got problem. It seems for the medical care, not only the money is matter, but money is not that important. Both our countries spend a lot of money in medical care. In the end, it's not getting very good result, or the results are not expected. Now, Professor Case mentioned the mortality rate in United States, uneducated rate, people increased very dramatically in recent years. And the two main reasons, one economic reason, because they have a less income and less job opportunity, and due to globalization, due to all the other reasons. The other one is because the Medicare system have a problem, right? It seems, I think that your argument is quite good. You said European countries are facing the same, economically facing the same problem, unemployment, globalization, everything. But their modality, their healthcare is still okay. Their life expectancy is still improving. So the only matter different is two Medicare system different. And as a Chinese, we are under the really need to big reform in Medicare system. So we would like to get you a more detailed information about what's the difference United States and European or other developed countries, which their result much better. They spend less, but they're getting better result. And what's the problem in United States? We would like to answer that question. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you both. And it's really very interesting to have these exchanges of views. You know, there's many impressive things about China, and China, of course, has its problems too. And it's very good to exchange ideas and to talk about each other's experiences and try to learn from one another. One of the things that I think is incredibly important, and most people don't understand, is that healthcare has very little to do with health, especially in rich countries. So that healthcare is very important. People need healthcare. People depend on healthcare. When you're sick, you have to have someone look after you. But population health, life expectancy, especially among rich countries, has very little to do with healthcare or healthcare expenditure. So let me come back to that a little bit. So one of the things when one's going back, as Justin did, and talking about low-income and middle-income countries and how rapidly it's possible for life expectancy to increase, a lot of that is because life expectancy is a terrible measure in those circumstances. And that's because you can increase life expectancy very, very rapidly by reducing infant mortality and child mortality. And we know how to do that. So you can get countries in the 50s, for instance, where life expectancy was growing at 4 years a year, just by cleaning up sanitation systems and doing vaccination and so on. We know how to do that. And we're really not talking about these problems in the US now, or I hope not, and nor in China, that's, you know, a middle to high income country now, when it comes to looking at those things. So the healthcare is difficult, really everywhere. And when we talk about how much healthcare costs in the United States, the cost is not hurting people through what they have to pay for the doctor or what they have to pay for the health insurance. The cost is hurting them because we're throwing away an enormous amount of GDP. And that is very good at making doctors rich and hospitals rich and device manufacturers rich and pharmaceutical companies rich. But it's basically a hijack. I mean, you've got this large, very expensive parasitical system that's making a lot of money out of the pockets of other people. And it has the consequences, and that's what our book is about, of making it very difficult for less educated workers to get jobs because of the cost to them and their employers of paying for healthcare. It's making local government very difficult because local governments have to pay huge sums of money to support Medicaid. And it's making federal government problems because, at least until COVID, almost all of the government, central government deficits were generated by the cost of healthcare. So this is like an enormous parasite on the economy, which is sucking resources away from all the other things that we need to have good lives. It's very little to do with the quality of healthcare or the bills the actual individuals pay. So to come back to some of the questions that Dr. Mentang raised, regulation, the government has to be involved in this. You know, private markets cannot do this by themselves. So every country has a different balance between how much of this healthcare is funded directly by the state and how much is funded by the market. And the US is at one extreme, China is by and large at the other extreme, though you still have private markets working there, and private markets can play a role. But one of the greatest economists of the 20th century was Ken Arrow. And Ken Arrow explained very, very clearly why it is that you can't have a private market for healthcare. And the problem was lack of information and the moral hazard that comes with that. So what happens if you try to have a market system with consumers who don't understand how to cure themselves? Then when you go to the doctor, it's not like buying a can of tuna fish or buying a bag of rice or something. When you buy a bag of rice, you know what's in the bag and you know what you like and you know what you need. But when you go to the doctor is essentially free to give you whatever they want to give you. And in America, we've let that get completely out of hand so that hospitals and pharma and device manufacturers can set their own prices and they can way overprescribe. So there's an enormously high prices compared with other European countries. And also there's enormous overprescription of very high priced but very ineffective procedures. So that's what happens if you don't regulate. On the other hand, regulation is always difficult, as you pointed out, and it can be a real problem. And then maybe I can end, and I know we're almost out of time, with the differences between European countries and so on, and what lessons, what China might have to worry about in this situation. I mean, what's happened in America is, you know, the economies continue to grow at a not very rapid rate, but large numbers of people are not getting anything out of that growth. So the sort of 2/3 of Americans that don't have a college degree and who are not minorities for whom there's been quite a lot of progress one way or another, those people are just not getting anything out of the system, and those people are being left behind. There's very little in the way of a safety net here. Our tax and transfer system does not make up for what happens in the labor market with globalization and technical change. And that, I think, is the big difference with Europe. Though you're getting some of the same things in Europe too, where, you know, there's people who feel like they're not involved, they're left behind. It's not showing up in deaths of despair, though you see some of that in Britain, you see some of it in Ireland, some of it in Canada, some of it in Australia. But you do see it in these political divides, which are much sharper than they've been for many years. So Europe is, I think, threatened by this, and it may just come later. But so far, their much more protective welfare system has protected them to some extent against what's happened in the US.
We have one more question.
Okay.
Recently, we have a very interesting case, and this is what we call a heart stent. That means to put some your heart upon, put a heart stent or a cardiac stent, and it used to be very expensive, like $2,000 for one. You have to put one in your heart, right? But recently, after government regulation and what we call collective procurements, and that price reduced to $100. And from $2,000, suddenly they use only $100 with that 97% reduced. People start very happy because then you have a heart attack and then you're getting this device. But in the meantime, many people start to worry. It's so cheap, only $100. Whether I dare to put in my heart. But in the past, we did have such kind of problem. Something very important medicine, but because government regulation makes it very cheap. When you make it very cheap, and nobody produces anymore, and that kind of medicine, that's a drug out of market. And so this regulation become a very subtle. If you regulate too much, in end, and because this is a company, it's a private company or for profit. If they're losing money, they don't want to do it. Right? So like these kind of things, how can we regulate? How can you make it still reasonable, make it a reasonable profit as people still can working in the business, but in the meantime, not getting high profit and using their, because they have this the information power, right? So this is any suggestion on that part? That kind of thing happened in the United States before?
No, but the producers are always telling us it's going to happen because they say if you don't pay our enormously high prices, you know, we won't produce it anymore. And then that's the reason they always give for charging very high prices. So we have the opposite problem you do, which is, you know, most of our medicines and procedures cost enormously amount more than they cost in Europe and Japan, let alone in China. So it identifies this problem here. You can't let the market do it by itself. You might say, well, let's just not have any regulations at all, and that is a disaster. So you've got to have regulation, and you've got to have good regulators. And sometimes the regulators get it wrong on one side, which is the example you've talked about, things too cheap. And more often, at least in America, where they pretend not to regulate, but they maintain high prices, we get the opposite problem. So it's not a problem, you know, pure market economists will say, leave it to the market and you won't have these problems. That's not possible for healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Interesting. As difficult as it is, the European countries are doing it better than we are doing it, right? So they're finding some middle ground from which we think we can learn about how one would think about the role and the weight of regulation on top of this.
Yeah, but in the meantime, we heard some stories that, okay, the quality of medical care in the United States still best. And European country may be cheap, but you have to wait for many months. Even for minor operation surgery, you have to wait quite long because before very long queue. At least we heard this about Canada like that. But is that true?
Canada's true. In Britain, it used to be true. But once again, you're going to have rationing because you can't have the market do this. If you let the market do this, you'll go bankrupt, which is what's happening here. You'll kill a lot of people that way. Otherwise, you have to have waiting lines. There's no choice about that. There's no perfect way of doing this. But it's just not true that American healthcare is better. Morbidity, pain, all sorts of statistics are much worse in America than they are in Canada or in Britain, for example. And Britain spends half of what we spend, and their health is better.
Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Lin, the question to you, and you give a very good presentation on the medical care reforms. Now the reforms are ongoing. And one of the problem is if 90% of the money is come from market, now if government would like to reform it, that means government have to pay for that, right? But you know that the government budget has always have a problem, limited budget. And if government really take over all those hospitals under a fiscal expenditure, and could be government finance may be bankrupt. So this, how can we balance? The other things, we have a lot of waste. And in fact, you know that's a lot of those unnecessary check or unnecessary medicines, drugs. And that, how can we make it can reduce this waste? The other one is, you know, now for the 三甲医院, the best hospital, always full of people. But for many, the lower end hospital, nobody go there. And this because from 三甲医院 also, they want to make money and they want to check all the patients come to them. That has become a more problem now. And we do not have spend enough money for the prevention. And we spend a lot of money for care, for treatment. But for the prevention, for health, that's not enough. So we need a very comprehensive reform on that. But what's your suggestion on that?
Well, I think that's a good question. And I like to refer to the answer given by Professor Case and Deaton. The root of the problem in the US is all the money making the doctor rich and pharmaceutical rich. And that is the true problem. And to some extent, that is also the problem in China when we carry out the market-oriented reform. Because, as I mentioned, the pharmaceutical, their prices are basic market. And they do have incentive to raise their prices. And doctors, their official wage is very low, but they get a lot of kickback from the pharmaceutical firms, and they also become rich. And so the way to really make these things improve is to allow pharmaceutical to have profit, a reasonable profit, and a doctor to have a higher wages, but reasonably high wages. And that should be the direction of the medical care reform in China. And I think that the Sunmin experiment is pointing to that direction. They control the prices for the medicine. and to reduce the profit of pharmaceutical. But at the same time, to turn the wages of the doctor to be transparent. They should have high wages, but they should be transparent. Currently, the government pay about 10% of the total expenditure. And the medical care, the insurance and so on, pay about 60%. And the patients pay about 40%, 30 to 40%. So if we can reduce the waste, due to those kind of loopholes, rent seekings, and by these doctors and by pharmaceutical, I think that it's not necessary the state need to pay more because, as I said, the insurance pay the majority. The basic insurance in the cities and the new rural insurance pay the main chunk. That is about 50% to 60%. If we use the fund efficiently, then we can have a much better system without much increase in the cost of the government and also the patients. And regarding the issue that the waste in our medical system, yes, the big famous hospitals, everyone want to go there. And then, in the county level hospitals, they did not receive enough patients. I think the way we do it, we should learn from the US and other, advanced country. The patient should first go to the family doctors to get advice. If it's just a flu, then they can just take some, over-counter medicine. That should be sufficient. And then from the family doctors, if the family doctor cannot deal with it, they can refer that to, let's say, county hospital. If the county hospital can take care of that, then they stop there. Only some kind of major disease or heart disease require, some, equipment or, or skill and so on. They should refer those kind of patients to higher level hospitals. I think that by this way, we can have a much better use of our resources, because so far the cost of seeing the doctors is so low, and that's regulated, and it did not see much difference if you go to a county hospital or to the national famous hospitals. The registration fee is the same, and you see the doctors, the fee is the same, and the difference is how much drugs, how much medicine, how many tests you do. And under that kind of situation, certainly everyone has the incentive to go to the big hospital, no matter what kind of illness they have. So if we practice kind of systems, then we can reduce the overburden of the big hospital and improve the use of resources.
Yeah, I believe it. I recall when we were young, and those days, even before the reforms, the system like this, you have to go to community clinic first, and only when the community clinic cannot care you, or you are quite a serious disease, and you transfer to the higher one. But now you can free, as long as you pay, you can free to go to any place. And then end of everybody jump to the best hospital. And also they put all the good doctor to the best hospital. And so this is the problem. But people know it, and people discuss for so many years. But until now, still not change much. So they already have a vested interest group, and they have an influence, and it's difficult to do that. But I'm sure the directions are on this way, and in fact, according to the government, the reform program is on these directions, and hopefully, step by step, they will getting better. Now, most important or most difficult part is still rural medical care situation. I went to many those villages and see this, and all villages, the barefoot doctor no more, now all private. But private those doctors again do not get enough training, and they have their problem. Now we try have a new area which we entered is internet hospital, because now a lot of doctors can do consultation using internet, and now we do have some hospital in urban area using internet to help those people stay in the rural area. But again, this current is still in the piloting, to how can do very systematic, how to really improve the situation. We still need a lot of tests. And nowadays have a problem of the legal issues, and if something wrong, the doctor will be sued, and then you internet, how you sue it, what the regulation should be there, still under discussions. But thank you very much, and we're all time out, and we have very interesting discussions, and we learn from Professor Case and Deaton, the problem of the United States, particularly for those uneducated young people and their health problem, but in fact that's related with the total medical care system or economic development system, and those lessons China should learn. And we in the middle of reform, Medicare reforms, and we have to learn from the other country experience. We're not repeating the mistake or the other country doing, and hopefully we will getting better healthcare system. And this pandemic really warming up everybody, and we have to be care. And if we do not have a good system, in end, people will suffer a lot. Thank you, Professor.
Before we end,
yes.
Before we end, could I have a question to
Sure.
Professor Case and Deaton?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
In your book, you attribute the loss of job opportunity, the stagnation of income for the uneducated white male to two factors. One is globalization. The other one is automation. My question is, which one is more important? The main reason for me to mention the question is that if there's no globalization, then the wages for those uneducated people will increase faster, yes. Then the enterprises will have a higher incentive to apply to adopt automation. As a result, their income will not increase either. So that's my, I wonder whether my analysis is right or not. And if my analysis is right, I think that, actually the main reason still, or more importantly, automation is the main reason for those kind of stagnation of income and the less job opportunity for the uneducated people.
Okay, I want to add in one more issues here, and it's very interesting. In China now, we are also go to automations. The reason is not, it's because for the factory, it's difficult to hire young people. They don't want to work in a factory anymore. Before, the young people would like to go to factory. Nowadays, the young people don't want to go to a factory. They don't want. They would like to stay in office or doing some white collar. They even would like to do a delivery. They like working this kind of job instead of stay in production lines in factories. That's also happened in the United States because young people, they don't want to work in the factories now.
I don't think we have very many factories left in the United States for people to work in. But let me correct a misconception which comes up again and again and again, which is this is not about white men. It's about everybody. It's about men and women. And as Anne showed, the deaths are rising for men and women in parallel. And so this is not like a men's problem, though many people seem to think it is. And it's been a problem over and over again. I'm sure that Justin is right, that if you look at the forces that are making life difficult for less educated workers, automation is more important than globalization. And in fact, US manufacturing has continued to rise. It's just employment in manufacturing that has not risen. So it's not because manufacturing went away. Manufacturing is still there. It's just it doesn't really use any workers anymore. But as Anne pointed out in the presentation, that's not going to take us very far because other countries in Europe, you know, they have robots in Britain, they have robots in Holland, they have robots in Italy. You know, it's not just automation. You have to explain why this is a peculiarly American problem. And what is peculiarly American is the extraordinary cost of healthcare and the way it's funded by tying it to employment. So that's the catastrophe. And either one of those would make things better, which is if healthcare were funded through general taxation, which it is in most of Europe, that would be better because it would not fall on low-wage workers so much. And also, if it were cheaper, that would be better. If it were cheaper and it were not funded through employment, it would be 4 times as good. 2 times 2 equals 4. And I think a lot of our problems would go away.
And thank you very much.
Yeah, we're
looking forward to see a Chinese version of your book.
Okay.
Yeah, very soon. I think it's
soon.
already under translations, and very soon we'll publish it in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.